Listen closely, Doctor. As you see, the passing ages have taken toll of me.
Yes, I know that feeling.
But unlike you, my time of dissolution is near.
Direction point! Direction point!
A Doctor Who podcast network.
Well, hi everybody. Welcome back to Doctor Who Literature, the podcast taking you through the world of the Doctor Who novelizations put out by Target Books from 1973 onward in publication order. We're a member of the Direction Point Doctor Who podcast network. My name is Jason, and I'm your host on this journey, this very long journey. Based on that audio clip that I played at the very beginning, we can only be talking this week about the Keeper of Traken, the penultimate Tom Baker story, the second to last story of season 18, and a show that fundamentally changes what Doctor Who is going to be going forward, as we'll discuss over the next 90 minutes. There are times as I approach my half-century mark that I feel kind of like the Keeper of Traken, sitting there in his chair. It's an interesting point because you can feel your memories start to go as you get older. It takes a lot more concentration to do certain things than it used to. The way that I make this podcast is definitely out of order. I read the book first while taking notes from my audio essay. Then I usually have my guest interview or conversation. Then I record my audio essay. And then this bit, the introductory, is the very last thing that I record, usually on Saturday night, a little bit before the episode releases. The reason I bring this up is because this gives me a chance to realize what I've gotten wrong over the next 90 minutes, which I have already heard and you have not. So over the course of the next 90 minutes, you'll see that I'm kind of like the Keeper of Traken, sort of reaching the end of my powers. I will mispronounce my guest's name, and I will get the name of his podcast wrong at a couple of points over the next 90 minutes. Just to be clear, it is Lelon Stoldt of the Indoctrination podcast. I've also noticed that there are a couple of points that I wanted to make about the Keeper of Traken in my audio essay, which I did not bring up. As most of you know, I did my Doctor Who pilgrimage, the classic series pilgrimage, on Twitter, mostly during the pandemic, starting on October 26th, 2020, and finishing the entirety of the classic series right around Thanksgiving 2021, just about 13 months later. Earlier today, on a Saturday, after I'd spoken to Lelon, after I'd recorded my audio essay at the end of the show, I went back to my Twitter pilgrimage notes on Keeper of Traken from August 2021, and you can find those too on Twitter under hashtag Doctor Who Pilgrimage. That's Dr. Who Pilgrimage. I mentioned a couple of things. In August 2021, I noticed that the Keeper says the Doctor's time of dissolution, unlike his own, is not near. That is, of course, a bit of a mislead, because not only does Tom Baker's Doctor die in the very next televised story after this one, but his being invited to Traken by the Keeper in the first place is what sets the Doctor's own dissolution in motion. It's a really important point. I don't know if that little snippet that you heard earlier was put in there intentionally by Christopher H. Bidmead as a way of teasing the next story, or if it is just a bit of writing that happily inherits a deeper meaning based on the way the rest of season 18 shook out. But it is very, very interesting, and I wanted to bring it up here, since it is probably not going to be discussed over the rest of this episode, unless, of course, I talked about it and have already forgotten that I did. One other thing to discuss before we get to it: we learned earlier this week that there is going to be a new Doctor Who multimedia experience coming called Doomsday that is going to encompass books and audio and comics and all sorts of other media, hence the expression multimedia. Haha, very good, Jason. You always were a bit slow on the uptake. We saw this a couple of years ago during the pandemic with the Time Lord Victorious series over on Trap 1. The panel discussed Time Lord Victorious at length. I was there to discuss one of the two Time Lord Victorious books. I bring this up, number one, because many of you are discovering this podcast after the fact. So for a good chunk of my listeners, by the time you hear this, Doomsday may already be finished. I'm just here to tell you from the past, and welcome to 2023, by the way. I'm here to tell you from the past that the original gut reaction from most of fandom to Doomsday was murderous. I have seen multiple snarky and angry comments on Twitter, on Facebook, on your social media of choice. I was not crazy about Time Lord Victorious. I did not experience the entire thing, but the one book that I did read, which I covered on Trap 1, All Flesh is Grass, I thought it was hit or miss. It seems to me that Doomsday is meant to be a little more comedic than Time Lord Victorious was, but I don't know. I haven't seen any of it. It's all in the future. I will keep an open mind, and I will be discussing parts of it on Trap 1 in the months to come here in 2023. The point is, I don't think that the reaction to Doomsday has been very fair. I am willing to give it a fair shot, and hopefully it is much better than everyone thinks it is going to be just based on the initial release. Just like that brief clip from Keeper of Traken. It's a line, doesn't seem that important, but when you watch the very next story after that, Tom Baker's swan song Logopolis, boy does it become important. On the other side of the break, Lelon Stoldt of the Indoctrination podcast. Excellent podcast. Lelon and his two daughters reading their way through the Target novelizations in story order. It's a very good show. Lelon has a lot of good points to make. We are going to challenge him to a game, but we're going to play 20 questions with a twist. And Lelon is going to set all sorts of records, as you will hear, over the course of the coming 90 minutes. And also, Lelon is going to challenge me to a game. And as with Doomsday, this is a game that is going to need time before we know the results. So if you are listening to this from the future, greetings from the past, I salute you. I don't know how the results of that game are going to turn out. We'll find out after the break. We have a lot to talk about this week. I reckon I've done introduced it enough. Let's get to it.
Are you ready to travel through time with us? Then check out Traveling the Vortex, a Doctor Who podcast. For nearly 7 years and more than 500 episodes, we've traveled from one end of the vortex to the other, making different stops with different doctors, reviewing everything from TV stories to audio plays, from books to comics, and more. Sean, Keith, and Glenn take you on a journey through 50-plus years of Doctor Who episodes and spin-off materials. You can find us wherever you get your podcasts, so be sure to check us out. And now, we're a proud member of Direction Point, a Doctor Who podcast network. You're listening to the Doctor Who Literature Podcast.
And we are welcoming back to Doctor Who Literature Lelon Stoldt from the Indoctrinated podcast. Lelon, good to see you again.
Thank you. Good to see you.
So I saw you at Gallifrey 1 in Los Angeles next month, and we had a chance to talk quite a bit at the annual Podcasters Meetup. So we met a lot of other podcasters. There was a lot more interaction this year in the Podcasters Meetup room, as opposed to last year when it was you and me and last week's guest, Adam Clegg, pretty much standing by ourselves for the whole hour.
Yes. It. I don't know what it is. Every Gallifrey has a different feel for me. It's just, and this one was, people were a lot more social. I mean, last year with COVID, I think a lot of people, even the people who went, were just like, you know what, I'm going to pass on the meetups in that small little room kind of thing. And this year, with everyone still on top of, like, everyone's wearing masks and stuff, I think people felt a lot safer.
Right, because last year, 2022, was the very first one after the pandemic eased, and it was smaller capacity. This year, I think it was a full sellout, and you had a lot more guests, and there was just so much going on that I missed a significant chunk of the convention in terms of guests that I never got to see, people that I didn't get to speak to, but there was a much more convivial group in the Podcasters Meetup room this year for sure.
Yeah, I got my cover for the Time Meddler. I got 2 copies, and I had them both signed by the artist, which was really cool.
Oh wow, was that Jeff Cummins? Because I know Jeff Cummins was there.
Yes. Like, there are so many guests. You really have to read the program carefully, because I didn't realize he was there, and I just happened to go to one of the panels about the art, and he was a guest, and he was mentioning it. And I'm like, oh, I wonder if he did any of these first Doctor novels. And sure enough, he did. And sure enough, someone was there willing to sell me an extra copy in the dealer's room.
What's funny is I was talking to Gareth Kavanaugh from Cutaway Comics, and they put out Vorp, and many other books. So I was talking to Gareth for quite a bit. and he was right next to Jeff Cummins' signing table in the dealer's room. But every time I was there, I never got to see Jeff. So I managed to go through the entire 3 days of the con without ever seeing him, even though he was high on my list of people that I wanted to talk to.
Yeah, I miss something every year. Like you can't do everything. There's conflicts. It's if you and I don't know. At my age, if I push myself too hard, I miss more than I make up for trying to see everything.
True. So in terms of missing, so I've been, as you've probably heard on this show, and as I've told you offline, I have like this prodigious 2 month backlog of podcasts that I have on my phone that I have not yet played. So I'm right now at late January, so I'm about 8 weeks behind, which is actually a big improvement over where I was a month ago. So I have one of your episodes coming up within the next couple of days. It's you and your daughters talking about the rescue. The last one of yours that I heard was Dalek Invasion of Earth a couple of weeks ago. So what are you and the girls up to on Indoctrinated?
We are very close to wrapping season 2. We're doing we're going to do one missing adventure just for fun, and then we'll go straight into season 3, no break.
So I'm going
And
to
then
guess, because we're talking about a season 2 missing adventure.
yes,
My guess is going to be Empire of Glass, which is Stephen and Vicky, set in between Time Meddler and the Three Doctors.
it's not. We're going to do the Plotters. We're going to do the Plotters, which falls between. It actually falls between the Chase and the one right before the Chase, the one we would have just done. It's escaping me at the moment.
Probably Space Museum.
Yes, the Space Museum, of course. Yeah, okay, that's why I can't remember it. But, and don't, if you know who wrote that book, don't take that selection as an endorsement of the author. I wanted to do a historical because my oldest daughter loves the historicals, and I thought it would be fun to do one that slotted in the space we were at, and that one just happened to fit. And I bought it off eBay without even checking who wrote it. But it is really, I mean, not to spoil it, it's really good. It's really good.
Yeah, I was reading all the Missing Adventures as they came out, so I would have read that on the spot live in the 1990s, and I do remember enjoying it. I did try to do a reread of it a few years ago when I was doing my Hartnell pilgrimage in 2013 for the 50th anniversary. I made good inroads into rereading it, but I never finished for whatever reason. And as current events have transpired, I don't have much interest in reading that particular author again. Which
Sure.
doesn't take away from the fact that a non-political book that he wrote 30 years ago might have been entertaining.
Yeah, I wish all the terrible people were also talentless, but that is not the world we live in. And it's, you have to make these choices as they come up. I certainly wouldn't read anything by that person. Wouldn't read anything new that was, funding them in any way. But it's the same with the New Adventures, because he wrote quite a few of those.
That's right. He got his start with The Highest Science, which was one of the early 1993 books. And then, of course, he ended up going on to write for the new series. So there are several new series episodes that Russell T Davies and Stephen Moffat were all too happy to have before things turned out the way that they turned out. But the reason why I was thinking Empire of Glass is because Empire of Glass is probably my favorite of all the Missing Adventures. And in terms of content, maybe a little bit ahead of where your daughters are in terms of adult content. But I thought Empire of Glass is a great historical setting like The Plotters. And it builds on real life events and real life people like The Plotters. And it's got Stephen, who is one of my favorite of the 1960s companions. And it's got Vicky, who is tremendously underrated at a time when Vicky's estimation and fandom was not quite as high as it is now. And then, of course, you have the tie-in with the Three Doctors. You have a character from the Doctor's future who shows up in some of the new adventures, which were running concurrently to the Missing Adventures. And then you have, a historical mystery work into that.
Yeah, I think you may have sold me on this because it's between season 2 and season 3, right? If it comes after the Time Meddler, yeah. So that we'll see how she takes to the novelization. The novels are definitely beyond my youngest's capabilities right now, but my oldest will breeze through them without any issues.
And one of the things that I wanted to say that I really enjoyed about your Dalek Invasion of Earth episode, number one, your younger daughter's emotional reaction to Susan leaving, which was, terrific. I think we all feel that way. But, I only have the one child, but I do have two cats. And the running gag around here is that I can never, ever get the right cat by the right name, which is kind of embarrassing because we name the cats after their colors. There's Smudge and there's Ginger. You can see Smudge on screen right now. It's pretty obvious why she's called Smudge. I am always calling Smudge Ginger, and I am always calling Ginger Smudge. So the fact that you ended up getting your daughter's names wrong, and I'm sure it's a running gag by now, definitely.
It's worse than that. I confuse my daughters with my wife a lot of the time, and that does not. When I'm telling them to do something, I'll use my wife's name instead of their name, and so it's a problem. We're working on it. It's like I have to put $1 in a jar every time I do it.
And once we reach a certain age, and I'm perilously close to reaching the end of my mid-40s, the memory definitely doesn't work the way that it did 20, 30, 40 years ago. That's a fact.
Yeah, and diving right into this episode, this is one that so we're talking about Keeper of Traken. I watched this at a very, very, very young age. And when you watch them that young, like pre-memory young, I was watching this before, I don't remember the first time I watched it, but I remember the first time I watched this run of episodes, sort of full circle through Kostrvalva. Probably, it's certainly my favorite run of the show. If you're looking at 6 full episodes, I don't think the show has had a run of 6 episodes that good. And watching those 6 episodes in 6 weeks, one after the other, in the full digest format, so the whole serial every week, kind of ruined my expectations for Doctor Who forever. Because now when they make a 10 out of 10 episode, I should be like, oh, wow, that's amazing. We're so lucky to have this in 2023. Like, aren't we blessed? My attitude's like, okay, do it next week. And then do it the week after, and then do it the week after that, and then do it one more week after that. Like that's my expectations of Doctor Who, and they're completely unreasonable because that's not how art works. That's not how television works. I mean, they can't make that many episodes in the amount of time, right? Those were full 4-part stories over 6 weeks, and they just the pace of that alone is insane. I'm actually reading the John Nathan Turner production diary, and you're reading the pages, and it's like you're on one page and it's like, okay, last day of filming for the Leisure Hive, and a few pages later it's like Leisure Hive airs on BBC One, and it's like, wow, they were pumping them out fast. They had like 6 days to shoot in studio. There is a memo that J&T has to send to his boss every time they go over by like 2 minutes. If they go over by 2 minutes, he has to send an explanation. And sometimes his explanations aren't good enough. So there's like a back and forth. It's crazy. That production diary doesn't have a lot of the creative discussions behind the episode, but J&T was, maybe everyone was like the BBC. I don't know how it was at the BBC back then, but certainly J&T was on top of his expense reports, because we know every subway, every car ride he took, and we know every play he saw when he was the producer of Doctor Who, because as the producer, you get to expense plays you see on the justification that you're like scouting new actors. But there aren't, there are some memos where he would sort of call out the production department for an exceptional episode. And I think this was one of them. Certainly there were several this season where he sort of called out the set designers and things like that. Not the prop makers so much, because the TARDIS console kept breaking and kept causing overruns, but the sets in the Leisure Hive and in the Keeper of Traken, and really this whole season, were spectacular. Which Terrence Dicks has a difficult job, because so much of this episode is about what's on the screen. And this is as straightforward an adaptation as I've read so far. I'm curious where that falls on for you.
So you make some really interesting points that I want to jump in and amplify. So number one, you talk about the really fraught production schedule and the tight turnaround. I may have mentioned this on my show before, but if I have, it was a long time ago, and I'm always getting new listeners, so I have no qualms about repeating myself. Also, when you are perilously close to the end of your mid-40s, your memory isn't quite so long-term anymore. So I don't know how long ago I would have told this anecdote, but production season 4, which is the run of Doctor Who that went from 10th Planet up through Tomb of the Cybermen, which overlaps televised seasons 4 and 5. But production season 4, they were on a 6-day turnaround. They were filming the episodes on Sunday and they would air the following Saturday. So it was 6 days from studio night to airtime, which means that when they aired episode 3 of Underwater Menace, and you know the famous cliffhanger, I'll let you do your dramatic interpretation of Joseph First's famous
I
rant.
don't remember that one.
Nothing in the world can stop me now.
Okay.
When that airs on a Saturday night in early 1967, they had not even yet recorded the resolution to that cliffhanger in episode 4. So if anything had happened, and Joseph First lived another 38 years, and we're glad he did because he did some great contributions to loose canon. If anything had happened to Joseph First in between the taping of episode 3 and the taping of episode 4 of Underwater Menace, they would not have been able to finish the serial. But because of the time the cliffhanger aired, they had not even made the next episode yet. That's how fraught it was. They had a little more time for season 18 because JNT, for any other faults, and we'll get to his faults later on in the life of this podcast, but he was very good at running the production ship. But the 6-day turnaround is incredible.
He got there. Season 18, he was getting his footing. So much so that he was named interim producer, right? Or essentially he was the producer on probation.
He had been the production unit manager the year before, and he was basically Graham Williams' brain. But yeah, when they gave him the full slot, they put Barry Letts in over him as executive producer, which Doctor Who had never had before.
Yes, but then at the end of season 18, when you kind of would have expected him to be named full producer, they still didn't do it. It wasn't until a little later because he had run over, like Leisure Hive had run over a whole day, and the other ones were continuing to run over. And so, but yes, certainly by the end, he was on top of that stuff. He had made an unusual decision, I think. He didn't want to have any directors that knew more about the show than he did. So he brought in a lot of new directors that first season, which feels fresh, but it also hits the schedule pretty hard. There's also so many strikes. Yeah, there's just this little thing where it's like, hey, the electricians went on strike this day and they lost a day of filming, and then they resolved it, and it just happens every couple of weeks.
Of course, Shada had been the very end of season 17. That was Graham Williams' last year, and that, of course, was obviously scuttled by a strike. JNT never able to revive it. But Adam Clegg and I were talking last week over Warrior's Gate. That was directed by Paul Joyce, and that was so bad that Paul Joyce was fired partway through filming. And, of course, they had to bring him back because nobody else knew how to work his camera scripts. And then Leisure Hive, which is coming up on this show next week, aired earlier by Lavette Bickford. That was also hideously overscheduled. Neither Bickford nor Joyce ever came back to work on the show again. And then after that, JNT starts working with very bland, non-innovative directors who could work on time and under budget, but didn't really do anything to advance the visuals of the show, such as Peter Moffat and Ron Jones. And that's harking back to last week's conversation that I had with Adam. So yeah, JNT was good at handling the purse strings, but he definitely did not do so well with some of these creative directors in season 18. Peter Grimwade, I guess, being the exception, because Grimwade obviously came back to direct again.
Yeah, it's definitely a mistake not to have the director of Warrior's Gate come back, right? Like you could have figured that out. right? Like you could have addressed whatever those were without without sacrificing the quality to the degree it did in later episodes.
He was basically doing new series style single camera directing, which Graham Harper later excelled at when he came back for the RTD era. And Graham Harper had been PA on Warriors Gate, so he was getting his feet wet on a attempt at doing single camera in a 4 or 5 camera studio. Paul Joyce was a couple of decades ahead of his time, but eventually TV production caught up with what Paul Joyce was doing.
Graham Harper directed Caves of Androzani, right?
That is right. That was also a fraught production from what I understand, although of course you could never tell from looking at it on screen.
Yeah, exactly. Like that guy knows what he's doing.
So the other point I wanted to amplify is you talk about these 6 consecutive serials that are magical, and I've been racking my brain. I'm trying to think if there's any other run other than Full Circle through Castrovalva that has that same 6 episodes of greatness. The best that I can come up with, and this is across decades, producers, color to black and white, the run from War Games through Mind of Evil, which is 7 serials. I think the weakest of those 7 is probably Terror of the Autons. And while that's the weakest of a 7-episode run, that's a really, really good run. My other guess would be Philip Hinchcliffe, but with Hinchcliffe, you have clunkers a little more frequently than 1 out of every 7. So Sontaran Experiment doesn't quite work. Android Invasion doesn't quite work. But I think Hinchcliffe and Derek Sherwin / early Barry Letts.
This was actually a conversation on Twitter, and there were 2 other answers, but I think they're both kind of cheating. One answer was like season 26 plus the TV movie plus Rose is technically a 6-episode run that is just spectacular. But like at that point, it's like, okay. And I think the end of series 5 going into series 6. So you have the series 5 2-parter finale. The Pandorica opens and the Big Bang, which is spectacular. You have probably the best Christmas episode ever with the Christmas Carol. And then you have the 2-parter that opens series 6, which is spectacular. And then you add 1 episode on either end. I don't think it matters. That's a really good run of Doctor Who.
And you also run into subjective versus objective when you're having this conversation. For my money, Survival is my least favorite classic Who of all time. I loathe it for many reasons, which we'll get to when I get there. I have a lot of problems with Survival. And when I watched it again during my pilgrimage in 2021, most stories in the pilgrimage I thought were better than before. That one I thought was even worse than before, and I hadn't held it very highly to begin with. TV movie, obviously, opinion is split on that. After getting to speak to Matthew Jacobs and seeing his movie at Gallifrey 1, obviously, I have a higher opinion now because I know where he was coming from when he wrote that screenplay. But yeah, if you're going from 1989 to 2005, that's a bit of a cheat to call that 6 straight episodes because it was 4 in one decade, 1 in another, and another in a third.
Yeah, I agree. And I also think I think a lot of people love Rose more than I did. I think I can't quite get past the burping garbage can kind of thing. I think that season picks up later on. Is Survival the last novel that gets released?
No, because they were doing a lot of stragglers. So, there were a couple of books coming out towards the end that were out of sequence, like Pescatons. Survival was the third to last season 26 novelization. That's book 150. Then you have Curse of Fenric, then you have Battlefield, then Pescatons, and then you have the John Peel books and the Barry Letts books a couple of years later.
Sure. All right. So picking back up at Keeper of Traken, like I said, this was the most straightforward adaptation I've read so far. I tried to pick out the scenes that were added in the book. I did not recognize them, so they couldn't have been that impactful. What were they?
I want to break that down in my audio essay, which follows this interview. Now, I have, as we sit here early in the week, I've already written it. I have not recorded it yet. There's one scene, I think, in the Part 2 material that is entirely new to the book. And then there are several scenes that go on for a lot longer in the book than they do on television. So I assume Terrence may have been working from an earlier draft, and he's novelizing scenes that were topped and tailed during production. So I'm going to read it out later on. But One of my favorite lines of the book that is not on television is in Part 4. Katura is lamenting that before the Doctor arrived, there were 5 consoles of Traken, and now they're down to 2. And it's a really powerful line, and I wish that Margot Vanderberg, who obviously goes back to the Hartnell era, I wish she had been able to deliver it. But for whatever reason, it does not get captured on the television.
My favorite part of this book is actually something they leave out because, and we had talked about how like my interpretation of the story has changed as I've gotten older. But the story, Cassia's behavior does not make any sense unless she has a really strong pre-existing relationship with the Melker. But in the episode, it is made very clear that when the Melker speaks to her on her wedding night, she is shocked. She has never heard it speak before. And that line is not in the book. In the book, it is left completely ambiguous as to how long she has been talking to the Melker. And reading and listening to Jeffrey Beavers read the episode, what I kind of picked up on is actually she's been talking to the Melker since she was a kid, and the Melker is why she is a consul and why she's marrying Treemass. And this is not the first, like her wedding night is not the first time she goes to ask the Melker for help, and that everything about the story is pointing to that, except this one line in the episode, and that line gets dropped in the story.
It's interesting you bring up about Sheila Ruskin. I saw somebody on Twitter within the last couple of days, and I don't remember who, and I don't remember the context, but it was very recently as we record this. Somebody was criticizing her acting as one of the detriments to Keeper of Traken, that she's a little bit over the top. I will have a little bit of a meditation in the audio essay after I finish speaking to you about how this is a woman who goes through an awful lot in what is basically a 48-hour span that the episode takes place in. And the novelization does miss an opportunity by not getting into her head. What Terrence does do that is not made clear on television, there's this moment in part 3, before Melker takes over the source and becomes Keeper. Melker zaps her with his eyes to punish her for some failure. And the book makes clear that this is the rest of her personality being burned away, so that she's no longer Cassia. So in the book, the Melker is not so much persuading her as possessing her, and it gets worse and worse as the book goes on. So it replaces her personality. So that's Terrence's interpretation of what's happening on screen.
Yes, and I think that's it. Yeah. The plot goes in such a direction that no amount of relationship between Cassie and the Melker would explain her behavior, and that's why Johnny Byrne introduces the necklace. Right, once she puts the necklace on, you can credit any behavior to the necklace at that point, right? But her behavior in episodes 1 and 2 can't really be rectified unless I think she was a lonely child, and I think she spent a lot of time talking to that Melker, and that plus what you mentioned, everything she goes through in those 2 days. I've always thought it was a really good performance. I think there are just 1 or 2 scenes where it's a little stagey. Like this is always sort of the problem is you are casting almost exclusively like stage actors, right? Into a lot of these roles.
Right.
And so they are giving a performance on a stage in front of an audience, not really thinking about how it comes off on television. And so there are some, there's that scene where she kind of faints or whatever that is really overdone.
Again, it's the fourth wall nature of the production, which is what you get in a multi-camera studio, whereas nowadays, of course, with single-camera filming, it's not fourth wall anymore. So this is not what she would have done. But again, Sheila Ruskin had been in I, Claudius. She was also on Blake 7 a couple of years earlier. She has a very long television career. So she's not a bad actress. Maybe people on Twitter will quibble with some of the line readings that she gives. I am saying this as an introduction. I actually do not agree with these criticisms. I think she gives a very good performance. My concern is this. When you are doing a female villain who does not survive the story, you need to write very, very, very carefully so as not to come across as a misogynist or promoting violence toward women. I will be discussing in the other half of the show a female character in the RTD era which straddles the same line. It's a female antagonist who comes to a bad end who really needs some redemption in the script and is never given it. So this is one of the few faults that I have with Keeper of Traken, and this falls on Johnny Byrne, not so much on Terrence Dix, who's adapting but not writing. I don't think it's a good idea to have a female villain like this and to leave it the way that it does, with her being disposed of at the end of part 3. So that could have used a rethink, but I don't think anybody in the production room was in a position to do anything about it. We know that Christopher H. Bidby do some heavy rewrites to the back half of the story. There just was so much else going on because you have a returning villain, you have a rare part 4 cliffhanger, you have this is now the first part of a trilogy, which is not the way the script was submitted. Bidmead is doing so much in edit while Johnny Byrne is out of the country that he doesn't have time to fix what I see as a problem with the problem of Cassia.
Yes, I don't think J&T told Johnny Byrne that, number one, Nyssa was going to be a companion, or number two, that the Master was supposed to be in the story. He made that decision after getting the scripts for at least the first few episodes.
Which begs the question, the only reason that Tremas is called Tremas is because Tremas is an anagram of Master. What was Tremas's name before they did that?
I don't know. The production diary does not cover that. And I
will recommend to you, if you haven't heard it yet, the audio commentary for Keeper of Traken, which has Matthew Waterhouse, and I think it's the only audio commentary that Anthony Ainley did before he passed away. They spent a lot of time doing anagrams because not only is Tremas an anagram of Master, but Adric is an anagram of Dirac, the mathematician. And they spent a lot of time doing anagrams for everybody else on the closing credits. It's a lot of fun.
Is that on the Blu-ray?
Yes, it should be on the Blu-ray. Sometimes they do extra audio commentaries for the Blu-ray, but they should have the original one from the vanilla DVD on the Blu-ray as well.
Got you. The thing I noticed watching Keeper of Traken as someone who's much older is that it's so English. If this were an American story written by an American, they would have blown up the damn chair at the end of the episode, right? Like the episode would have been about the fact that like all of these people are developmentally repressed because they have given themselves to the Keeper of Traken, who essentially parents them, and like they just can't cope with the scenario that they've been presented, right? And I don't know if we're supposed to think that the head security guard is taking bribes. Like, I don't know if we're supposed to read that as the harmony of Traken is actually a fraud and it's not as harmonious as you think, or if this is just another symptom of sort of the Keeper's waning power, and there's just this period of transition where the society doesn't function correctly, and you just have to hope you get through it. But either way, the Doctor never has any real criticism for their system of government other than he doesn't like the fact that some poor soul has to sit in the chair. So it's like he's empathizing with the monarch, whereas like as an American viewer, I was just like this would never fly in the States. Like this just sort of acceptance of giving yourself so much to a single person and letting them run everything. And it felt like the episode was trying to get to that point, but it never quite gets there. I think intentionally.
Tony Witt, who does the senior podcast to my junior, the Doctor Who Target Book Club podcast, he covered Keeper of Traken 2 or 3 months ago. He and his panel hated the book, and I don't think they were very fond of the TV story. I'm very fond of the book, which I read first, and I love the TV story. The point that they were making is that this is basically a fascist society, and I apologize if I'm misquoting Tony and his panel, but if you listen to their episode, it does raise some similar points to what I'm paraphrasing here. So they arm the Proctors after they find only one dead body, even though the Proctors had not been armed for generations, we're told. The Proctors were conceived as Eastern monks in the original draft, which had a lot of what was perceived to be an Eastern influence. I'm not sure how much Johnny Byrne knew about the cultures in the Pacific Rim, but he was going for an Eastern mystique vibe, which is problematic in itself. A white English author trying to mirror another culture.
Luckily, they don't. Luckily, that all gets scrapped. Like I don't think there's any of that here.
But coming at this on the other side of November 2016, this is an anecdote that I'm going to tell in the other half of the podcast. I screened this cliffhanger at Long Island Doctor Who November 2016, which is the Saturday after the 2016 election results. And I screened this cliffhanger for part 3 on purpose because it's Melker suddenly taking over the power of the Keeper. Nobody thought this could happen. Nobody is prepared for what's going to come next. But even before that, there are signs that this is a very fragile, enlightened democracy, because how quick are the consuls to agree to start executing people left, right, and center on very flimsy evidence? Keturah seems to have a bloodlust for killing people, even though she's a sweet old lady who was engaged to William Hartnell's doctor in the Aztecs. The actress, not the character. So what's happening on Traken is not as enlightened and as progressive as we think. And it just shows you that you are never more than 30 days away from a democracy or a republic turning into a very stern, bloodthirsty oligarchy or authoritarian system. And we saw that perhaps with 2016, depending on your political leanings. We saw that on January 6, 2021. So I think the point is, no matter how good a political system looks, there's always a danger. And you have Melker / the Master exploiting what seems to be a very idyllic system. But the system was ripe for exploitation because the people running the show are not as pure and innocent as we'd like to believe.
For sure. But is it your interpretation that this is a result of the Keeper's waning power, or is it your interpretation that the harmony of Traken is oversold?
I think the harmony is oversold because, yes, there's a lot of talk in the story about superstition. People are keeping a watch on the Melker, believing that he's going to be their messiah, so to speak, to use a loaded political word. Keturah is a consul. She's an older woman. She presumably has been around for decades before the Keeper's power started waning. She is very quick to give up on the rule of law. Cassia, may be manipulated heavily by Melker, but Luvic is a wet blanket. He has no firm leadership at all.
Yes, the fact that he becomes Keeper, it feels the story feels politically confused. It definitely leads us in directions that it does not follow through on, because they are setting up the potential to destroy the machine, right? They get the schematics, they find the place to short it. There are all these comments, when Atchie's like, oh man, you don't want to be there when we press this button. It's like, okay, we're going to press that button in episode 4, right? And then the doctor's like, the line is hilarious. Tom Baker's like, hey, if you want to keep this thing going, you better go sit in that chair. Like, first person to get there wins.
So Luvic wins the game of musical chairs. And now I suspect that a lot of that stuff about the doctor blowing up the source, I suspect that was Bidmead. We know that Bidmead did a heavy rewrite on parts 3 and 4. And that's when the story goes from Eastern mystique to hard science. So, but I think that I think the story is less confused. I think Johnny Byrne is deliberately giving us a political system that looks great, but is not and is at risk. And I think it's a warning for everybody. And I think recent events in American politics has made this story look pretty prescient. So I'm not really inclined to criticize it for being confused. I think the confusion is the point. I think Tremos is the most enlightened of the 5 consuls, but that's because he is much more into science. Everybody else is a quasi-religious mystic. Saron is the best of the 5 in terms of the most honest and the most upright, and he dies because he has a blind belief in the goodness of the system. He believes that he can trust Cassia. He believes that rapport with the Keeper is going to exonerate him, but it doesn't because Melker is lurking behind the scenes. This is definitely a science over religion and philosophy story. And again, some of that may be Bidmead overriding what Johnny Byrne was trying to do. But I think the 5 consuls are all important. They're all a different personality type. They all serve a very big role in the story. And we're not supposed to cheer Luvic on for taking over at the end. And what does Bidmead do in the very next story after this one? He blows it all up. He kills Matula Oriantis off screen. Luvic is presumably the last Keeper of Traken because they die 3 weeks later. So that may be Christopher Bidmead giving his final judgment on whether or not the harmony of Traken is a good political system.
Perhaps. I think it's muted somewhat by not concluding the story in a way that reinforces whatever message it's trying to send. And yeah, it does feel like Bidmead is coming in with the sort of science prevails over all else kind of thing.
I don't know if you've read the BBC Past Doctor adventure, Divided Loyalties by Gary Russell.
I read it once when it came out. It's not a winner.
I was on Reckard's Doctor Who when this came out, and Gary Russell and Reckard's Doctor Who had a long-running series of philosophical disagreements, which was made most clear in his book, The Scales of Injustice, which came out a few years before Divided Loyalties. But Divided Loyalties is nominally a season 19 story, so it takes place shortly after Traken. And it tells us that the Keeper survived, and the Union of Traken was a lot more planets than just Traken itself, and it survived the events of Logopolis. So Gary Russell comes in 20 years later and gives the story a belated happy ending. I don't know if that's what the production team in 1980 would have wanted, but that's what we have now in our pseudo-canon. So Gary Russell did give this story a reasonably happy ending after the fact in a book that is not perhaps the most beloved novel ever written.
There are some audios, too, that touch on the legacy of the Trakenites and the source. Because there's that whole thing where Nyssa comes back after Terminus, rejoins the crew as a much older person, and they have a whole series of adventures. It's interesting. As much as you and I love season 18, it's virtually ignored in the extended universe. There are no Virgin Missing Adventures in season 18. There are no BBC Past Doctor adventures in season 18. There are a handful of comics. There are a handful of audios. I mean, granted, Tom Baker didn't start doing them until somewhat recently, right? But
last 10 years, yeah.
Yeah, it's... I feel like we are on the outside looking in, and I don't think this is a universally popular season of Doctor Who. But even then, I'm shocked at how you just look at one of those continuity guides that puts everything ever made on the list, and season 18 is so short because there's just nothing interleaved in there. Because I think if you're going to tell a Romana story, you just said it during season 17, right? And no one wants to tell a Tom Baker Adric story, I guess.
It's ripe for the doing. I think the two of them are a terrific combination. And I'll talk about this over the coming weeks. There's a season 18 Adric and there's a season 19 Adric.
Yes.
The Adric of Traken and Logopolis, these were two of the first stories that I found. I'm 11, barely 12 years old. I am a big fan of Adric the character because of the novelization of Logopolis, where he's the Doctor's solo companion, and then this story where he's the Doctor's solo companion. And this is being added to the lineup after the story had already wrapped. So I think he's a very good character, constantly peppering the Fourth Doctor with questions. The Fourth Doctor is kind of an adoptive father or father figure, an uncle figure maybe. I think Adric works very well in this story. And in my bubble of podcasting, we are all huge season 18 fans. You ask anybody who's been on this show, season 18 is right up there among their favorite stories. I had people clamoring to be season 18 guests, and I'm glad that you're the one who got this story because you and I are all part of the same pro season 18 bubble. When you look at the 2014 DWM survey, and they're in the middle of doing their next survey for the 60th anniversary, so the 2014 survey is soon to be overwritten. Only 2 season 18 stories are in the top 100. I will give the answer later on, but can you, Lelon, guess which 2 season 18 stories made the top 100 out of 241?
It's kind of cheating because the game we're going to play later is all about the Doctor Who magazine poll. It's definitely Logopolis is definitely one of them, right?
Logopolis is the highest ranked season 18 story. It's quite a bit lower because for me it's the greatest story of all time. And if I had to take one bit of Doctor Who and I had to throw out all the rest, if I were to put 59 years of Doctor Who in storage in a garage, and if I were to lose my entire stock in the garage due to administrative error, and only one thing were to survive, I would keep Logopolis. But yeah, that is the highest ranked out of the whole series in 2014. So what do you think is the other story in the top 100?
I know the answer. It is Keeper of Traken, but that's not what I would have guessed had I not looked at the list before this. I would have guessed State of Decay. I thought State of Decay was a bit more popular than this one. But no, Keeper of Traken narrowly makes the grade.
Yes, it is the only other story in the top 100. I was very surprised. I am shocked that Leisure Hive is as low down as it is, because for me, it's one of the all-time greats, and that'll be a spoiler for next week's episode when another guest is joining me to talk about Leisure Hive, as it's called in the UK, and Leisure Hive, as we call it here in the colonies. So I want to move on to our game of 20 questions in a minute. Before we do that, we've talked a lot about the book. We've talked a lot about the politics of the TV story. Talk to me about Jeffrey Beavers. Where does he rank for you on the all-time great masters? Because even though this is his only TV story, Jeffrey Beavers has been a staple of the audiobooks and of Big Finish, and his master has had a very long afterlife. So what do you think of him?
I don't think I've listened to any of the audios he's done. So for me, he's above Deadly Assassin Master, but he's below all the ones who have been in multiple episodes. The person who really gets a gold medal here is whoever who is doing his makeup, because he looks spectacular and creepy in this episode, but he can still act off Tom Baker. You still see his face. And it's hugely effective when he comes out at the very end. Like you said, that cliffhanger that you are not expecting as a Doctor Who fan. You do not expect a cliffhanger at the end of a serial going into the next serial. That's part of why, like, as a kid watching these 6 episodes in a row was so mind-blowing. It felt like Doctor Who was leveling up, because you have sort of the E-Space trilogy, you have the Master trilogy, you have this thematic background of entropy that's connecting it all, which, like, even as a kid, you kind of pick up on that all these stories have a feeling that is resonating with you as an audience member, even if you don't know what the word entropy is. And I think it was a big mistake not to go back to that. I think it was and again, when they tried again with the Enlightenment and the Turlough trilogy and the Black Guardian trilogy. And then they don't, I guess Trial of a Time Lord kind of does that, but it's not, they never go this hard thematically again in Classic Who, until maybe season 26.
That's all on Christopher Hamilton. He was coming back from the future. He said the future is story arcs, and he got there before anybody else.
Yep. And I think it's a lesson the new show could learn too, frankly. I think it's very hard to do Doctor Who in 43 minutes. It's just really hard to do. You end up dropping something that was critical to this formula, and it's not like the 2-parters have had a huge success rate, but I think something's got to change in the way that they approach the show, and I'm hoping Russell T Davies is going to do something that none of us expect. It's very exciting.
When I did my new series rewatch in 2022, I was very disappointed. I think most of the first RTD run, 2005 to 9, does not hold up. But having also watched It's a Sin, I think he is capable of so much more. Because, again, you mentioned the burping garbage pail in Rose. He was trying to figure out who this show is aimed for. So he's trying out a lot of different things, and a lot of stuff doesn't take. Now that he's written a lot more serious and hard-hitting drama, I think we're going to get a much more serious, almost season 18 dark Doctor Who when RTD comes back. That's what I'm hoping for. I don't know at all, because I don't know what's coming, but I am hoping that he makes the show a little darker and a little more serious and a little more absorbing, because we could use more Keeper of Traken moments in the new series. I guess Utopia, Sound of Drums, Last of the Time Lords comes close as a trilogy, and I bet you that was partially inspired by the season 18/19 Master Trilogy. But yeah, I would like to see a lot more of this, and a lot less burping garbage pails, and a lot less fat jokes, and a lot less other stuff that RTD was doing that doesn't stand the test of time.
I will. I was going to say. I mean, I will bet a huge amount of money that there will not be any more fat jokes in Russell T Davies' Doctor Who. I think he is grown as a person from where he was then. But I do think when you start making Doctor Who and you're targeting a demographic as opposed to targeting a kind of person, you've already lost. if you're making it for kids or you're making it for 40-year-old men, that's not how you do it. You are targeting a kind of person who likes Doctor Who. And so, I mean, it's circular logic, but the answer is you just make Doctor Who. And I think that, especially series 1, it's just such a narrow version of Doctor Who, right? We go to Earth a lot. We spend a lot of time in modern day London. The companions in the new series have all been more or less young, attractive London urbanites or Sheffield urbanites or whatever. And you compare that to what the show could be. And I think you get a really obvious answer as to what the new spinoffs should be. Like, don't do a spinoff that's like for kids, or don't do a spinoff that's like, the rumor now is that there's this unit spinoff, right? So it's like, okay, take Doctor Who, take the doctor out, put it in an office. I don't think that's the recipe, right? I think the recipe is you make the other kind of Doctor Who that the Russell T Davies is not interested in. Like, put Romana in a TARDIS, have her go to Gallifrey every so often, do season arcs, have antagonists instead of monsters, right? Like, do everything else that Doctor Who can be, and that's your spinoff. Because Russell T Davies just doesn't like that. Like, Russell T Davies doesn't want to tell that kind of Doctor Who. But as a result, we've had a very narrow version of the show. I think Chibnall tried to break out of that a little, but that's the spinoff I want to see. Like let's just see Doctor Who turned up to 11 and see what happens.
And I'm going to add to that. I am coming off a rewatch of Better Call Saul. I was watching 2 episodes a week between last August and just now. The drama on that show and the inventive camera angles and the use of time jumps, where when they go to black and white, it means you're in the future rather than the past. That's a very creative and gripping, really dark show, with moments of comedy, of course, because it's mostly sketch comics who are in the cast, and yet they're putting on a very dark production at times. Doctor Who doesn't always have to be science fiction. When you look at Power of the Doctor, which is very noisy and very loud, I want to see this show go small once in a while. I want to see tight, intimate dramas. I don't always want to see sci-fi, because this was a show that did historicals for the first 4 seasons. Not everything needs to have a wacky, silly CGI sci-fi creation in it. I want to see Doctor Who try different genres again. But we're running a little low on time. I want to come back to Jeffrey Beavers, because you told me before we recorded that you did not just read the book, but you also experienced the story in another format.
Yes, I listened to the audio novel that Jeffrey Beavers reads.
Does Jeffrey Beavers do any line readings very different in the book to how he delivered them on television?
No. If anything, he's a little more subtle. It's almost like he doesn't want to break the character of the narrator to do the characters of the Master's voice. He's doing something really weird when he's doing Tom Baker. He's doing a voice that I don't recognize as anyone. It sounds very aristocracy in a way that I can't put my finger on. Sounds nothing like Tom Baker in terms of tone or cadence or anything. Everything else is perfect. That's actually why I chose to listen to it and read it, is because he did the reading of that. Sometimes for my podcast, I listen to them instead of read them. If the kids are ahead of me and I'm falling behind, I really like to record right after they read it. I go to great efforts not to tell my children what I think of the story until they tell the listeners what they think of the story. And that's why it's kind of like my podcast is very awkward, because the first thing we do is we rate the story 1 through 10, right? And we get that because I don't want to impact or influence what they think in any way. And I don't let them hear what anyone else thinks either, right? Like, the idea is, what does someone who is like in a vacuum, what's that term that everyone loves to talk about? Received fan wisdom, right? There's no received fan wisdom on my podcast. Like, that's the goal. That said, I failed at the Web Planet. I could not hide my lack of satisfaction with the way that story ended. Like, I'm laughing at the screen, but most of the time they have no idea what I think going into the recording.
And Web Planet is your next episode. That is going to release a couple of days before this episode hits the wire.
Yes.
So I will link to that in my show notes. And so you've recorded most of season 2 by now.
Yes.
So what's coming up next? I guess you're going to be getting to Galaxy 4 next.
Yeah, well, we have a big giveaway. Actually, I got 2 copies of this Blu-ray that actually hasn't been released yet. I like everyone's showing their. So today's the day the season 3 comes out. Everyone's getting their
Yeah.
not season 3, season 9, right?
John Pertwee season.
Yeah.
Season 3.
Everyone's showing their Blu-rays, and I'm still waiting for the last one, the US version, which is supposed to come out at the end of the month. But I've got an extra one. We're giving that one. So that's the UK version, right?
I got the UK. I'm doing the Trap One podcast episode on this, so
Yes.
I cheated. I got the UK version first because I do have a Region 2 external Blu-ray drive.
And that's why we kind of had such a long break. We are going to watch the final episode of season 2 on the Blu-ray. I've timed it that way. But yes, I have 2 copies. We're giving away a copy to anyone who we're going to do a drawing, and all you have to do to enter is send a question for the wrap up. We do a wrap up at the end of each season to talk about sort of all the stories, and we rank them, and we talk about the companions and stuff. And so if you listen to a recent episode, send a question for the girls about Doctor Who or whatever. And if we use it, we're giving away that extra copy of the Blu-ray.
Great. So let's jump over to 20 questions. I have selected from the randomizer.net 1 Doctor Who story at random between 1963 and the present, with the possible exception of Power of the Doctor. Ordinarily, my guest tries to figure it out with 20 yes or no questions, but you have told me you're going to try a slightly different approach.
Yeah, everyone's freaking out about these chat bots, right? This chat GPT. And so I want to exert our dominance over this AI and see if we can beat it. So I have access to this chatbot. I have given it a very generous prompt on how to play 20 questions, and it's going to try to guess the episode for us. So I will play the part of the chatbot. And the first question the chatbot would like to know, is it from the classic series of Doctor Who?
No, it is not from the classic series of Doctor Who. Chatbot question 2.
Is the actor who plays the Doctor David Tennant?
No, the actor who plays the Doctor is not David Tennant. Chatbot question 3.
Is it Matt Smith?
Yes, the actor is Matt Smith. Chatbot question 4.
All right. Is the episode from the first half of Matt Smith's run as the Doctor, seasons 5 through 7? It seems very confused.
That's an impossible question. I will say that it is from seasons 5 through 7, so that's a yes. Now, it's not from the early part of the run, but it is from seasons 5 through 7, so yes. Question 4, the chatbot is correct. Chatbot question 5.
Did the episode feature the Weeping Angels as the main villain?
No Weeping Angels to be seen. Question 6, and this is where the chatbot has a chance to catch Conrad for the all-time king.
Did the episode feature the Silence as the main villain?
No.
We can be loose with the definition of main villain.
No, the Silence is not part of this episode. Question 7, I think we're at. And no, Conrad, your title is safe. The AI is not coming for you, buddy.
Are the Daleks the main villain?
No, Daleks are not the main villain. Question 8.
The chatbot is thinking. Does it feature the Cybermen?
No, it does not feature the Cybermen. Question 9. I bet you the chatbot may be the first person to lose 20 questions.
Yes.
Question 9.
All right. Does it belong to the 6th season of the show?
No, it does not. Question 10.
Oh, it's made an incorrect assumption. So the episode you've selected is from the 5th season. I'm going to have to correct it.
Yeah, so that is wrong. It is not season 5, so we're going to count that as a...
So it wants to know if River Song is a major character in this episode.
No, River Song is not a major character in this episode. I think that's question 12 now. What's question 12 going to be?
Did the episode feature the character of Rory Williams as a companion of the Doctor? I think we got it beat.
No,
it's very confused.
Not a Rory episode. Question 13.
Interesting. Does the episode feature the character of Amy Pond as a companion of the Doctor?
No, it does not feature Amy Pond. Question 14.
Okay, so we are definitely in season 7.
Correct.
Did the episode you have selected feature the character of Clara Oswald as the companion of the Doctor?
Yes, it did. Wow, the chatbot is terrible.
Yeah. Did the episode feature the Great Intelligence as the main villain?
No, it does not feature the Great Intelligence as the main villain. I think we're at question 17 now, so this
Uh-oh.
chatbot better get its thinking programming on.
Is it the Rings of Akaton?
It is not the Rings of Akaton. Question 18.
Is it Journey to the Center of the TARDIS?
It is not Journey to the Center of the TARDIS. Question 19.
Is it
Only
Hyde?
one guest in the history of this show made it to question 19.
Is it Hyde?
It is not Hyde. Question 20.
Oh my gosh. Is it the name of the Doctor? Well, that can't be because the Great Intelligence, well, we already know that's not the case, right?
Right, so I may be one question off, so I'm going to give you one extra question. This will be question 20 or 21, but this is the last shot that the chatbot has.
Yes, and it's
the chatbot smarter than anyone else who's ever appeared on this show ever?
And the chatbot has made another mistake because it wants to know if the episode is Asylum of the Daleks, which it can't be because it doesn't have any of those people in it.
That's an Amy and Rory story. So the chatbot has failed, and the answer would have been Cold War.
Oh my God, that was the next guess on the chatbot.
Well,
wow.
Folks, you're listening to Doctor Who Literature History. The chatbot is the worst 20 questions contestant we've ever had. It made a lot of wrong assumptions. It never came close.
By the way, the chatbot has even a harder time in Classic Who. It loves those villain questions, which I think are a waste of questions in terms of strategy. If it had just narrowed down the season first, it could have got to that point where it could have just iterated the episodes. But yeah, we'll have to keep an eye on the emerging tech.
I wouldn't call it emerging right now. Maybe in a year they'll have fine-tuned it, but it is not quite ready to go the full Skynet and become self-aware.
Yeah, but it's definitely reading the wiki. Let's put it that way. It's definitely reading the TARDIS wiki. All right, I've got a quick game for you if you have time.
Go right ahead.
All right, so we have talked about the Doctor Who magazine poll they did 10 years ago, and they're doing another one. So we're going to play Doctor Who buy, sell, or hold. I'm going to give you an episode with a dollar value between 1 and 100. $100 being the greatest episodes ever, with $1 being the worst episodes ever. And you're going to buy, sell, or hold that episode based on where you think it's going to rank in the new poll. So we've normalized them based on percentile 1 to 100. So you're trying to figure out, again, not whether you think it's overrated or underrated, but what you think the Doctor Who magazine readers are going to think. So let's start with today's episode. Keeper of Traken. You can get that for the low price of $62.
So in other words, do I buy it thinking the actual value is going to be $90, or do I sell it the actual value is going to be $20?
Yeah, exactly.
I would sell it because I think that fandom is not going to have Keeper of Traken in the top 40%.
Wow. Now I got to remind you that the big thing that you're gambling on is not necessarily changing opinions, but also where all of the new episodes that weren't ranked 10 years ago get slotted in, which is basically, I think it's basically, I mean, it's obviously all Capaldi, all Jodie Whittaker, and I think Matt Smith's last episode was not in that poll.
Right.
Okay, so you're selling Keeper of Traken. All right. Reign of Terror, First Doctor historical episode, $31. I will mention that this animation was released in January of 2013, which I think is the year they did the poll.
I will buy, and I think that's going to go up, and I think I can sell that for at least 50 or 60. So I will buy Reign of Terror.
Love it. Okay. Carnival of Monsters, highly rated, $75.
Oh, I would sell. I don't think it's nearly that good. I would sell, and I think the value is going to be somewhere in the 50s.
See, I agree that's also overrated, but I don't know. I feel like I'm way on the outside looking in on that one. I think everyone loves that episode, and I don't quite know why. I love all the parts with the Doctor in the, what do they call that? They have a great name for it. Not the microscope, but the
miniscope.
The miniscope, yes. But those two characters on the outside, and every time we cut back to them and they're talking to the Dards, I don't get the love for that episode. All right, let's go low. 4 to Doomsday. I can get you for $10. 4 to Doomsday.
I would hold that.
You're going to
That's
hold
a hold. I think that's about right.
You don't know which way. So you can't make money on a hold, so you don't know where it's going to go.
I think it's going to be right around the bottom 10%,
right.
so I would hold that.
Okay.
I got time for one more.
Battlefield, $36.
Hold. Well, actually, no. I'm going to sell. I think Battlefield is lower than the top 60%.
Whoa. Wow. Okay. So we
I
will
think
have
that's
to.
going to fall in the bottom 20-25.
Wow. Okay. So we will have to review where you ranked next time I come on after that poll is released.
And I've already got your next appearance booked, so hang on to those rankings, and we'll see if my playing the Doctor Who market is as effective as my playing the stock market. Ha ha. All right, Leland, I got to run. Thanks so much for joining us. This episode will come out on Sunday, and I will link to your Web Planet episode, which comes out a few days after we record that, but a few days before this comes out.
Awesome. I'll pitch one more thing. If you do like this era as much as Jason and I, the JNT biography written by Richard Marson, available by 10 Acre Films, is a fabulous read.
The most money that I've ever spent on a book ever was on an auction copy of that before the recent reprint. It is an amazing, phenomenal book, and I cannot praise that enough.
Yeah, it comes in and out of print. You won't find it on Amazon. You have to go to their website to order it. It's pretty expensive to get it in the U.S., depending on the exchange rate, but it is worth it.
Again, I've never spent more on a book than I spent on that, but it was worth every single penny. All right, Leland, talk soon. Have a great night.
All right, thank you.
Doctor Who and the Keeper of Traken by Terrance Dicks, televised as the Keeper of Traken, teleplay by Johnny Byrne, televised in January and February 1981, published in May 1982, cover artist Andrew Skilleter. For ages past, the Union of Traken has lived in peace and harmony thanks to the power of the Source, controlled by generations of keepers. But the current keeper, his powers waning, senses some all-pervading evil about to invade his world. He summons the Doctor to his aid. To save Traken, the Doctor fights the terrifying Melkur, only to find that this new enemy conceals an older and even deadlier foe, one the Doctor has encountered before. I'm going to open this essay by laying my cards on the table. I love The Keeper of Traken on TV. It's a gorgeous story, another visually pleasing, well-written, thrilling Season 18 adventure with lots of twists and turns. I'm a Season 18 guy, and I live in a Season 18 house. But you know this already. Unless you're new to the podcast and this is your first episode, in which case, welcome. Hope you stick around. The thing is, as much as just about everybody in my little podcast circle, the shows I listen to, the people I have on as guests, the people who have me on as guests on their shows, we're pretty much all Season 18 people. We pretty much all live in Season 18 houses. But the last DWM survey, and if you're new to this show and new to Doctor Who fandom, that's Doctor Who Magazine, only has 2 Season 18 stories in the top 100. Lelon and I talked about this earlier. Logopolis at number 62, which is at least 60 places lower than it would be on my own personal ranking, and Keeper of Traken at 94. That's a good debut showing for Johnny Byrne. Unfortunately, both of his other Doctor Who stories fall in the bottom 40 in that same survey. For me and my podcasting circles, though, we all think that there are many lovely ideas in Season 18, and Keeper stands out as perhaps its most elegant story. Now, yes, maybe there's an audible shift between the first half and the second half, as Johnny Burns' original ideas start to give way to Christopher H. Bidmead's rewrites. But then in the back half of the story, you also have the reveal of the returning villain. Remember, this episode kicks off a trilogy and a classic Part 3 cliffhanger, more about which later. Byrne never novelized any of his Who scripts, so default duty fell to Terrance Dicks on all 3 of them. Now we're in May 1982, and the book immediately before this one, Warrior's Gate, that's episode 67 of this show, is from a first-time writer with a very different style and focus than Terrance, and the book immediately after this one is from a second-time Target writer and is almost a wholesale top-to-bottom reinvention of the TV story. The novelizations are in the middle of undergoing a noisy regeneration as we sit here in 1982 reading our third straight season 18 adaptation. This book is just 118 pages, medium-length Terrence, and yes, unlike the season 18 stories that were or will be novelized by their original writers, Keeper is not a radical rethink of what we saw on the small screen, introducing new characters a la Warrior's Gate, or new poetry a la Full Circle, or berserk satire. Stay tuned for next week's episode. This is more of Terrence's standard work. You'd think there wouldn't be that much to say about it, especially after how much time I spent talking about Stephen Gallagher's novelization last week. However, I am happy to say that Traken the book is entertainingly fast-paced, taut and intense when need be, and technically pretty near perfect. Terrence rarely wastes words, never chokes his books with run-on sentences or purple prose, of the type that may afflict some other Target writers we have not yet met on this journey through the books in publication order, this very long journey. And what Terrence does do, really for the first time since the novelization of Terror of the Autons, is add a lot of material that we did not see on TV. Material that I suspect was scripted by either Byrne or Bidmead, and was cut for time during production. As you read the book, you're going to encounter several extended scenes, or perhaps some new scenes that you will not find on BritBox, or on your DVD, or on your Season 18 Blu-ray box set, or on your Doctor Who delivery medium of choice. So in that sense, yes, Terrence is giving us a bonus, exclusive, only in print version of Keeper of Traken, and that can't help but make the story even better. Chapter 1 is titled Escape to Danger, and yes, I did dash off a quick message to Jim Sangster, frequent contributor to this show, and author of a publication order Target blog of that name. Hey Jim. Chapter 1 is also a nifty bit of mythology, as Terrence has to summarize the just concluded E-Space trilogy, explain the departure of Romana and K9, as seen in the last book, reintroduce Adric, whom Terrence had shown us only in passing in the State of Decay novelization, episode 66, and introduce the Union of Traken and its keeper. As did Byrne on TV, Part 1 is told largely in flashback, recited by the keeper, a neat narrative device little used by Doctor Who after the Verity Lambert years. Terrence also dips in and out of the Doctor's head as this is happening, letting us know what the Doctor really thinks of having the Keeper commandeer his TARDIS. Time reveals all, Adric, said the Doctor, hoping that it would. Terrence gets off a bunch of memorable descriptions just in the first few pages. Adric is a smallish, round-faced, snub-nosed lad with an expression of cheerful impudence. Romana and K9 were, the cool, sophisticated Time Lady, and the opinionated little computer in the shape of a robot dog, the oddly assorted duo, end quote. The Keeper of Traken's face is, quote, wrinkled like a winter-stored apple. The Doctor is intrigued, rather than discouraged, by the Keeper's promise of danger, and worlds of backstory are implied in this single sentence on page 17. Reluctantly, Nyssa came to stand between her father and his new wife. Think about that for a moment. But don't think for too long. I don't want you missing the rest of this essay. Terrence in Chapter 1 also includes more world building than he usually had time for in his previous books. He describes more of Traken's foliage and architecture, befitting the sumptuous-looking TV production. And in the first of those many added or extended scenes, here we see the Keeper named Tremas as successor on Tremas' wedding night, which you won't see on TV. In Tremas' first POV scene, page 20, Terrence has him remark on the cruel irony of the Keeper virtually ending his marriage by naming him next Keeper on the night of his marriage. Chapter 2 contains even more snippets of dialogue not on TV, and good stuff too. Page 22, Adric turned to the back page. There isn't even an index. Life doesn't have an index, Adric, said the Doctor magnificently. Also in Chapter 2, we see the Foster die. On screen, we only join the discovery of the corpse, and the Doctor references Capability Brown after seeing the gardens of Traken. Chapter 3 is very short, 6 pages, unusually short for a Terrence chapter. Not much to see here, at least. Chapter 4 has an interesting budgetary fix, page 38. Terrence has Melker kill off 2 extras. On TV, that was just 1. On page 44, Terrence drops in a reference to the TARDIS's chameleon circuit, a line not spoken on TV. I assume Bidmead worked that into the script to prefigure what's going to happen in the next story after this one, although not the next book after this one. In context, the TARDIS has gone missing and the Doctor wonders if the chameleon circuit hasn't started working again. So let's hold that thought until episode 72. In chapter 5, Terrence takes a break from rushing through the material, as he'd been doing in the last 2 chapters, and gives us 2 short but well-chosen paragraphs to give us more insight into Adric and Nyssa. I really like these brief bursts of observation. Top of page 46, beginning of chapter 5. Although they were a little wary of each other at first, Adric and Nyssa were soon well on the way to becoming friends. Adric was cheerful and easygoing by nature, and Nyssa was a pleasant, friendly girl, starved for company of her own age. Tremas was the only one of the consuls to have children. Since his duties meant he had to live close to the sanctum, Nyssa spent much of her time with older people. As for Adric, he was beginning to feel that, from the Keeper downwards, practically everyone on Traken was old, eminent, and bearded. That, by the way, is probably the most polite thing that Terrence will ever say about the facial hair sported by Robin Soames in this story. In fairness to Chapter 4, Terrence had given us one of his trademark breakfast menus, as the Doctor and Adric dined in Tremas's quarters. Chapter 5 also gives us a scene not on TV, where Adric and Nyssa spy on Proctor Neiman from a distance, and the 2 mull over a way to get rid of Neiman, so they can sneak into the grove and find the Doctor. Top of page 53. Nyssa thought hard for a moment, looking at the sturdy form of Proctor Neiman. There might be a way. I'll have to go back and fetch something first, though. Fetch what? Some kind of weapon? Nyssa smiled. You might say that. The weapon that opens most doors. Even on Traken. You wait here. And this continues on the top of page 56. Beginning of chapter 6. When Nyssa returned to the gate of the grove, she was carrying a heavy purse. Adric looked at her impatiently. Where's this weapon of yours, then? Here, said Nyssa, and hefted the purse. Adric heard the faint click of coins. Ah, I see. A couple of notes on the story. This is the 3rd novelization with Adric, but really the first one that makes him interesting. Not a knock on the 2 previous writers, one of whom was Terrence himself, but it's just that the nature of the character has finally caught up with the demands of production. Adric would have been a late addition in both State of Decay and Warrior's Gate, and his proper debut story, Full Circle, has not yet been novelized as we sit here in May 1982. This story, and personally I think Adric's at his best in the 2 stories where he's Tom Baker's solo companion, features both his artful dodger persona and his mathematical excellence, and he is not yet the raging misogynist that circumstances will force upon the character during season 19. So enjoy this while it lasts. Also, chapter 7 is a cell block chapter, that old Doctor Who staple. In an era where stories were constrained by budgets and small studio spaces, it's easy to have your characters spend more than half a given serial in a simple cell block set. See Frontier in Space, or Snake Dance, or even An Unearthly Child for more examples of that. But in season 18, the Bidmead season, the Doctor himself is locked up I think only 3 times for the whole year. Part 4 of Meglos, Parts 3 of both State of Decay and Traken here. The Doctor will get arrested in other stories, but the cell block set is little used. Be grateful. One thing missing from this novelization is Cassia. I mean, the character is here. All of her TV dialogue and scenes are here, with a little more dialogue than we got on TV. Terrence rarely lets us inside her head. The character's emotional journey. And think about this. Lelon and I talked about it a little bit earlier in the program. Cassia's emotional journey during the events of Keeper of Traken is immense. We witness her marriage, the loss of her new husband to the Keeper ship, being cajoled and then possessed by the Melker, murdering poor Seren, who never gets any justice in the story, taking over the rest of the consuls, and then dying horribly at the Part 3 cliffhanger. What is she thinking as all this is going on? We never find out. For new series purposes, the closest comparison is probably Miss Hartigan in The Next Doctor, a character who should be a sympathetic villain of the piece and who deserves a shot at redemption, but in the end is denied both and also dies horribly. Of course, I like Traken a lot more than I like the other one, but I'd like this book better if we had any look at Cassia's inner thoughts, especially during the fateful Part 3 material. Terence, on page 79, does at least have Cassia killed early, effectively, as Melker punishes her over the Doctor's escape from captivity. Quote, "Twin beams arced from Melker's glowing eyes, and for a moment Cassia twisted in agony. The beams faded, and she stood zombie-like, all her original personality burned away, now utterly and completely a creature of Melker. This is a nicely gruesome twist on the TV material, where the production did not make that sort of detail clear." A couple of months ago, Jeff and Paul on the Who Corner to Corner podcast did a countdown of their 10 greatest Doctor Who moments. Well, I say a couple of months ago, but I only just heard it this past week due to my prodigious podcast backlog. It was a thought-provoking list, and naturally I would not have included many of their choices in my own such top 10 list, but it is a great thought experiment, and those are just the two guys to run it. For me, Keeper of Traken's Part 3 cliffhanger would probably go high on such a list. Think about what happens at this cliffhanger. The surprise reveal of who Melker is, the villain we haven't seen on the show in 4 years at this point, at least in television terms, counting backwards from early 1981. The revelation that Melker is a TARDIS, the death of Cassia, the arrival of Melker in the Keeper's chair, not to mention the proper arrival of Geoffrey Beevers into the action. Beevers, whose continued tenure as the Master, has been one of the very best things about the Big Finish era. At the LI Who convention held the very week after the November 2016 U.S. presidential election, I played this cliffhanger as part of my annual Cliffhangers panel, and drew many pained murmurs of sympathy from most of the audience. I regret that I never got to see this cliffhanger in the wild unspoiled. I would have read the L'Officier program guide summary first, and then I read the novelization shortly after reading the program guide, so I only ever watched this moment already knowing what was going to happen. But in its way, this is at least as strong, if not stronger, as the Spyfall Part 1 cliffhanger, which was high up on the Who corner-to-corner lists, and which does feature a very similar revelation to this one.
Look into my eyes, all of you. There is nothing more that you can do, Doctor. So look, and you will die swiftly.
A merciful death. Refuse, and you will regret it.
No. We know what you're up to, Melkor, and we'll stop you. That's a promise!
But it's too late, Doctor. The source is mine. And soon, very soon, you will feel its power. Now, this Traken web of harmony is broken. I am free.
By this act, Cassia, you are physically confirmed as Keeper. Prepare for access to the source. May you bring peace and blessing for all your time, Keeper.
Council, don't do it!
You again!
Fosters, these traitors have no business here! Council, Cassio has betrayed you all. Don't complete the transition.
Do your duty, Catiora. Complete transition!
Don't listen to our counsel.
Complete transition!
No, Catiora!
Transition complete. You now have access to the source, Keeper.
The Keeper! We warned you, consuls! It's your only chance to cure the TARDIS. Take this and you will wait. It's too late. That's far too late.
How does Terence rise to the moment of capturing this in the novelization? With a very underrated subtle paragraph, He doesn't tell us who the creature inside Melker is, as Melker turns to face the camera, but he uses enough language left over from his earlier novelization of The Deadly Assassin, episode 36 of this podcast, and then writes this very interesting paragraph, quote, "A curious wheezing groaning sound filled the air, but the blue police box stayed exactly where it was in the grove. It was the statue of Melker that dematerialized. This is definitely an oh bleep moment for the book, a surprise not spoiled by the back cover blurb. Throughout the book, though I have not pointed out every instance, Terrence's scenes go on longer than they do on TV, likely vestiges of earlier drafts. One of the best lines from Keeper of Traken is in the book only, page 96. Consul Keturah, yes, Margot Vanderberg, who went from William Hartnell's doctor's fiancé in 1964 to trying to execute Tom Baker 17 years later. Quote, Keturah looked accusingly at the doctor. For all we know, you are the cause of this. There were 5 consuls before you came. 5! The doctor said, I'd be willing to bet that soon there won't be any, the way he's going about things. Terrence doesn't add a lot of description to certain action scenes. This is not necessarily a fault. The rollover car crash in Flannery O'Connor's A Good Man is Hard to Find is described in a sentence or two. In the hands of a Stephen King or a Tom Clancy, that same rollover crash might have taken a page and a half, if not more. Sometimes simplicity and speed make for the most attention. Treemass's forced murder of Proctor Neiman, orchestrated by Melker, is a horrific TV scene. Terrence tells it in about a page, middle of page 115 to middle of 116, and adds only 2 details. One, that Neiman is helpless to stop the sweat from dripping down his face, and the other that Neiman, after being shot, doesn't actually collapse to the floor until Melker mentally releases him. This is terrific. Terrence adds just what he needs, and not a sentence more. In the book, Chapter 12, Melker twice refers to the Doctor as Time Lord, though he doesn't on TV, after having used the phrase earlier in the story. I wonder if this is not a vestige from an older script, removed in between rehearsal and post-production, before it was determined that Melker was in fact going to be the Master. After a book peppered with subtle hints, Terrence pulls back the curtain on page 118, and with what would have been a powerful pang of nostalgia for days gone by, Terrence flashes back, as only he could do, to the Master that he co-created and script-edited, the Roger Delgado Master. Page 118. The Doctor found himself in a TARDIS. Not his own TARDIS, of course. The decor was in black, not white, and the shapes were subtly distorted. Standing at the console was the horrifying figure of his oldest enemy. The Doctor looked almost with sympathy at the loathsome figure in the tattered robes, remembering him in the days of his strength and pride. The stocky, powerful figure, the darkly handsome face, with its pointed beard and burning eyes, the deep, hypnotic voice. All of that was gone, decayed, so that all that was left was a walking corpse. But there was still a tinge of the old irony in the now familiar voice. Well, Doctor? Of course, I should have known. I think I did know, really. The Master. The Master smiled. Welcome to my ship. Less nostalgic, but far more gruesome, is Terrence hinting just what the Master plans to do with the Doctor's body. Page 119, quote, the Master looked thoughtfully at the Doctor, rather like someone studying a suit of ready-made clothes upon a rack. The subtlety of this line may be lost on first-time readers, or those only half paying attention, but once you know what's coming, this is pretty awful. I mean, awful as in horrific to think about, not awful as in bad writing. We'd finally see the Master possess the Doctor's body on television in 2023, in a script that several times pays homage to Logopolis, the next televised story after this one, but Terrence knows how to imply the body horror of the Master's intent without being too graphic. Another improvement in the book over the TV is a small subplot involving Luvic. Luvic is, how shall we say, the least important and least characterized of the 5 consuls of Traken, and excepting Anthony Ainley, he's also the only consul actor who returned to the show after this episode. In the book, he protests that he's not worthy of being Keeper, before he runs into the chair to fill an urgent void. Keturah being too old and Treemass being out of the room at the time. Keturah issues a valedictory, page 121, quote, Old Keturah smiled. There was greatness in him after all. None of that's on TV. None of it. It doesn't make up for Luvic being an indecisive wet blanket for the rest of the story. Interestingly, we'll see Johnny Byrne recycle the idea of the 5 consoles in his next TV story, Arc of Infinity, where there are 5 Time Lords with similarly structured names, Luvic becoming Zorak. But there's no Zorak subplot anywhere in Arc of Infinity, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on your point of view. Terrence also does a bang-up job adapting the Part 4 cliffhanger. Keeper of Traken is the first story in a trilogy, and is one of the rare Tom Baker-era final episodes that ends on a cliffhanger. The final page. The door opened, and a hooded figure slipped out of the grandfather clock. Thoughtfully, the master surveyed his paralyzed victim. A new body at last. It wasn't quite what he had planned, but it would serve. The master had learned much from his brief contact with the source. He stepped closer to Tremas, and their bodies merged. The master disappeared, and Tremas changed. He became younger, strong, and upright. His hair changed from gray-streaked brown to glossy black, becoming shorter in the process, and the straggling beard became black and sharp and pointed. The deep, resonant voice said, "Now begins my new life." The master was himself again. He laughed, exulting in his new strength. He was free to roam the cosmos again, just like the doctor. Somewhere in time and space they would meet again. The master disappeared inside the clock, and with a strange wheezing groaning sound the clock disappeared. Nissa came rushing back into the sanctum. "Father, what's happening? Are you coming?" Tremas was nowhere to be seen. Nissa shivered, looking around the empty sanctum. She seemed to hear the distant echo of mocking laughter. I would say Terrence has still got it. Next time, on Doctor Who Literature, we jump back slightly to the premiere story of Season 18. I am joined by one of the most prolific guests on this podcast. We're going to talk about a book that has very little to do with the television story that birthed it. It is a book full of wicked satire and graphic violence and some social commentary. Next week, join us as we discuss Doctor Who and the Leisure Hive, for those of you in the States, or, for everyone else, Doctor Who and the Leisure Hive. Thank you for joining me on another episode of the Doctor Who Literature Podcast. Special thanks to my special guest, Lelon Stoldt of the Indoctrinated Podcast. This podcast can be found on most of your podcast apps of choice. You can find all past episodes at anchor.fm/DoctorWhoLit. It really helps if you rate 5 stars and subscribe. You can find me on Twitter at Doctor Who Novels, that's DrWho Novels, and on email at Doctor Who Literature, that's drwholiterature@gmail.com. Please drop me a line with your comments, questions, and suggestions. Thank you for listening, and whatever you do, keep turning the pages.
Direction point! Direction point!
A Doctor Who podcast network.